Welcome to this GameSynth tutorial series. In this video, we're going to cover the Whoosh model. In this model, you can easily create whooshes for things like weapons, spells, or even ambient wind noise. And I'm going to show you some of its features and how you can use them. So to start off, let's have a look at the strokes panel. It's the biggest panel in the center of the screen, and it's the main means of interaction that we have with our patch. Here we have an XY grid, where the X-axis controls panning, and the Y-axis controls pitch. This panel also registers pressure, so if you have an external drawing tablet, you control the amplitude of the playback. This means that by pressing softer, you can get quiet sounds. By pressing harder, you can get louder sounds. And unlike in other GameSynth models, our drawings stack, so with these two shapes, if we play it back, the sound is played back as a combination of the two. And we can use these two arrows to navigate between the different layers of our drawing. On the right-hand side, we have access to some presets, and these can be used as a good starting point, and some of these also provide interesting modulation, such as this shape. On the top and bottom of this presets panel, we have these two edit boxes, which can be used to adjust the pitch range. So if we set this to 80 and play it back, you'll hear that the overall range is being decreased. At the bottom, we have these three toggle options. So on the right, we have panning. If we switch that off, our sound will play back in mono. If we turn off pressure sensitivity, this will stop the patch from reading pressure information, which is gained from a drawing tablet. And then on the left, we have our envelope. So if we switch this off and turn the LFO down and draw, we can create our own custom ambient wind noise. Next up, we have our sound sources, which is made up of three components. The first of these are deflectors, which are adjustable noise bands. Again, we have a grid system, but in this case, the X-axis corresponds to pitch and the Y-axis corresponds to amplitude. The best way to understand and demonstrate how this works is by looking at the presets on the right-hand side. These presets correspond to the type of sound that these deflectors are designed to imitate. So if we select the first of these, we'll see we get these two thin points, and if we play that back, we'll see that we get a very thin resonant sound. And if we select the last of these and play it back, we can hear that we get a very harsh, noisy sound. So we see how the size of these bandwidths change in either case. So we can use these as a starting point, and then we can double click to draw our own points in. And then we can hold down Control and left click and adjust the bandwidth of these noises. Next up, we have the sample section, and this allows you to use your own samples as a sound source, which is one of my favorite features. It allows you to interactively manipulate existing audio and apply loads of randomization to it. So a good example of how to use this is in the Fire Pass By preset. So if we open this up and play it back, you'll hear the sound of a fireball whooshing past. But if we listen to the original source audio by clicking this play button over here, we can hear that the original sample is nothing more than a static recording of a fire. So by using all of these features in the Whoosh model, we can reenact our samples as if we were performing Foley. And then by using this pitched toggle option over here and drawing back, we can get a high pitch by drawing higher and a low pitch by drawing lower. And of course, we can stack these as well to create richer sounds. Next up, we have our drop tone feature, and this is quite a niche feature, but it can be useful for adding some bass and weight to your whooshes. So I'll load up the Monster Pass By preset. And then if we go to drop tone and first invert these so that the pitch decreases rather than increases, change our pitch envelope to soft exponential, and then keep modulated sine as the amplitude envelope. But I'll change this as well to modulated sine. That way these two will match up. And then by setting this up to max and playing it back, you should be able to hear a very low-pitched bass frequency underneath the whoosh sample. If we play that back in context of the original, we can hear that the sound just becomes a bit more aggressive and weighty, so it can be interesting and useful for that. And just a quick edit, since 2019.2, the Whoosh model also allows the use of other patches within GameSynth to be used as a sound source. And this means that you can now add an extra layer of interactivity to the other models, such as the modular model, which has somewhat lacked dynamic control until now. So if we go into our modular section, I'll just quickly load a patch that I've made. And in here, it's just an oscillator going into a mono output, and I've set up a meta parameter to control the pitch of the oscillator and just renamed that to pitch over here. If we go back into our whoosh section and load that patch in, we can then assign that meta parameter to one of the three components of our sketchpad. So if I set that to pitch and set that level to max, just turn the deflectors off and draw in with that, we can now hear that the pitch is being controlled by drawing on the x-axis. So this can obviously be used for more than just whooshes, and I will definitely be covering this feature in more detail at some point. Finally, we have our envelope section, and here we can create our own custom envelopes. We can set the duration at the top, and we have access again to some presets on the right. We can also access more presets by right-clicking on the window, and we can use impulse, for example, which is great for creating snappy sounding whooshes that don't have decay tails. And as in the sound sources section, we can double click on the grid to draw in our own points. We can move them around. We can also use the arrow keys to move them and just generally define the kind of shape that you need. We can also analyze our own samples and extract the envelope from existing audio. So a use case for this might be if you needed to create additional layers for sound design. So if you have some pre-existing audio that you'd like to add a whoosh on top of, you can drag in the sample and use its envelope. So this makes layering sound much quicker since the rendered sound will line up perfectly with the original sample. It can also be used as a way to create a more natural effect. So if you have some whooshes already recorded, you can use them as a starting point and then customize them further in GameSynth. And then finally, we have our parameters section on the right-hand side. The first of these is LFO, or low frequency oscillator. Here we can add some modulation and movement to our sound. So if we set these up to max and play it back, you hear that we get a very choppy, fluttering sound. And if we just set a smaller amount, we can just add some gentle movement to the sound. Then we have a variations panel. Here we can apply some randomization to the playback. So we can randomize the duration a little bit, and this corresponds to the duration of our envelope. We can randomize the deflectors, and this will randomize the amplitude, the pitch, and the bandwidth of all of our deflectors. Movement corresponds to panning, and the pitch range corresponds to randomizing our pitch playback. Then we have our master panel, and here we can apply some post-processing effects. So we can click on the EQ to access the settings, and we have access to a 5-band EQ. We can select any of these points and change the shape of them, and we can move them around and generally tweak them as we need. We also have access to some saturation, so we can add some distortion, we can add some noise back, some delay, and also some gain. So if we've pushed the saturation or the EQ too high, we can decrease the overall gain a bit. An interesting feature that you can also access, any of these parameters which have a yellow center can be dragged up and down to adjust the random range. So in this case, we can adjust the amount of saturation within a random range. So every time the sound plays back, there'll be more or less saturation. One thing that we can also do as well is we can change these A and these M. So these correspond to meta parameters and automation curves. So we can click the plus button here to make an automation curve and this button over here to edit it. We then have access to a panel which looks very much like the envelope on the top left. If we right click in here, we can access some more shapes again. So if we select the impulse and close that, we can then drag that onto the A next to saturation. And this will override any value that we have in here. But it means that every time we play it back, it will follow that curve shape. So if we just play this, you'll hear a very sharp, snappy sound at the beginning of the sample. Of course, we can rein this in by drag selecting all of these and holding down on the keyboard, just so that we can make the effect a bit more subtle. And if we play that now, we can just use that to add some transient, and we can apply this again to any of these with the A or the M next to them. And then once we're happy with our final sound, we can go to the render option at the top, and we can specify the number of files. We'll call this transient whoosh. We can change the starting index. So if you've already rendered 10 samples, starting from 0, we can set the index to 10 so that we can prevent overwriting the originals. This variation setting globally scales the amount of variation that we have in our other settings. So if this is set to 20% and this is set to 100, it means that this will stay at 20%. But if we set this to 50%, everything will be scaled by half, so this will become effectively 10%. And then finally, we can set the number of channels and the bit depth. So we can say show in folder when done. If we click render, it will ask where you want to put it. And then we can say select folder, and it will render them out. And we have our 10 samples, so we can just play these back now. And you'll hear that each of these are a little bit different from another.